May I kindly request that you take your respective seats so that we can begin. Good morning, Your Excellencies. Kindly requesting that you take your respective seats so that we can begin the high-level segment. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Distinguished heads of the state of government, delegate, honored guests, I now open the fourth meeting of COP27, fourth meeting of CMP 17, and fourth meeting CMA 4. As we continue the national statements, I would like to remind distinguished speakers of the action in place to ensure effective time management. There is a 3-minute time limit for the statement during the high-level segment. A statement should be as concise as possible, noting that full text of the official statement will be made available in the UNIFES CCC websites. And finally, please note the head of the state of government who are not in the plenary at the time for delivery and their
Excellency, Mr. President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. Profits at the expense of human civilization. While they are profiting, the planet is burning. If this continues unabated, our entire human civilization will be imperiled. The time has come for us to move from advocacy to action. Action that is fully implementable, and certainly to ensure the full implementation of the climate agenda to save our planet from near total destruction. We need urgent collective action to reduce emissions and to end fossil fuel subsidies, the proceeds of which should be redirected and used to fund adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, especially in small island developing states. Financing to address loss and damage, and a recommitment to keeping 1.5 alive in the face of the current energy crisis are the key critical success factors of COP27. Loss and damage should not be seen through a divisive and controversial lens, but as a form of climate justice for climate change's hapless victims and a decarbonization accelerator. We unequivocally must establish a loss and damage response fund here at this COP. The adoption of the agenda item is just one step, and we look forward to the establishment and operationalization of the fund by 2024. After 30 years, SIDS should be demanding more. Establishing a new multilateral loss and damage fund is a small token when our members are losing up to 200% of GDP in one day from a single climate event. We recognize that in a world where might conquers right and power triumphs over fairness, the advocacy of small island states can be easily brushed aside and ignored. Determined to achieve urgent, just, and sustained climate action, a group of AOSIS member states, including Antigua and Barbuda, Tuvalu, Palau, and Niue, have registered with the UN Secretariat a Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law, COSIS. COSIS will explore the responsibility of states for injuries arising from their climate actions and breaches in their obligations. As small countries, this is the new dynamic pathway of justice where the polluter pays that we bring to the process of climate diplomacy. Ireland, Denmark, and Belgium have begun to show the way by announcing support to developing countries that have suffered damage due to climate change. It would be right for the major polluters, particularly those that have been involved in the historical use of fossil fuel energies, to follow this example. Mr. Chairman, the world now faces more floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires requiring an urgent response. Therefore, not only in the interests of small states, but in the interests of the global community, we will fight unrelentingly this climate crisis. And this includes fighting in international courts and under international law. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Macky Sall, President of Senegal. So, Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Monsieur le Président de la 27e conférence des États parties, de la conférence de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques, Mesdames et Messieurs, au nom de l'Afrique, encore une fois, je voudrais remercier l'Égypte pour l'accueil de cette COP qui remet au cœur de l'agenda mondial la question vitale du changement climatique. L'année dernière, nous avons adopté le pacte de Glasgow sur le climat, un compromis après plusieurs années de négociations.
What we do to fight against climate change, and this pursuant to the Paris Agreement. Africa here today renews its commitment under the Paris Agreement and its commitment to our specific needs being taken into account. What we want is a just energy transition, which is also equitable, and this in the context of the negotiated mechanisms and the partnerships for a just transition, instead of unilateral decisions which could seriously jeopardize our ability to meet our sustainable development goals. Our development goals, in particular, universal access to electricity, which 600 million Africans are still not entirely entitled to. Let's be clear, we are in favor of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but we Africans cannot accept that our vital interests be ignored as we undergo this energy transition. We are low emitters. However, we remain the most vulnerable to loss and damage triggered by climate change, water stress, the loss of coastal areas, loss of biodiversity, all cycles of drought and floods, and drop in farm productivity, inter alia, are all problems we encounter. However, we as Africans play a role in what is being done to combat climate change, in particular through the implementation of energy mixes to bring about a low-carbon development resilient to climate change. That is why it's important that COP27 adopt ambitious decisions on the financing of this essential component of our negotiations here. I would like to recall that according to the IPCC, Africa on its own needs $86 billion every year, and this by 2030, to fund its adaptation needs. So the $100 billion aim promised to support climate action for developing countries is the basic minimum we need. Once again, I would like to thank here the European countries and the Gates Foundation for funding what we do in Africa. We would call upon the other countries and partner institutions to also support our contributions. May I also recall that, as far as adaptation is concerned, developing countries are those most funding what they do themselves to fund their own infrastructures by resorting to debt. They're taking on debt when they should rather be receiving funding from what we have together agreed. So we have funded our own adaptation efforts, and we are facing a situation in which we are the victims now, which means that we are being doubly punished, and we are not ready to put up with that. So in the face of this climate emergency, we, countries of Africa, have been focusing on the development of resilient agriculture. Resilient agriculture which is tailored to our ecosystems. So with our land and water resources that have been properly used, highlighted through technological and financial resources that are tailored to our needs, Africa can, on its own, feed itself and contribute to feeding the rest of the world which is going to be increasingly exposed to food shortages. It is in this spirit that Senegal, in cooperation with the African Development Bank Group will be hosting the second Feed Africa conference in Dakar from the 25th to the 27th of January next year, 2023. And I would like to invite you all to come there and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Alar Karis, President of Estonia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that the tipping points and planetary boundaries are nearer than we previously thought means only one thing. We shall not delay or dilute the Glasgow and Paris agreements. The Glasgow Climate Pact is truly ambitious for its critical decade, although we need to go even further and close the book on phasing down unabated coal. COP27, under the Egyptian leadership, hopes to take a step forward on adaptation and implementation. The Glasgow Pact provides a good framework for this too. After all, to save human lives, both adaptation and mitigation are required. The present fossil fuel energy crisis only speeds up a decisive push towards climate neutrality through renewable energy. Russian war in Ukraine has inflicted horrible human suffering in Europe and endangered energy and food security globally. In spite of short-term adjustment, the EU remains committed to ambitious 2030 goals. The era of fossil fuels will give way to the new era of sustainability, circular economy and clean solutions for a simple reason, that the solution will save the most money and make greatest improvement to our lives' quality. For us in Estonia, this transition makes perfect sense. Having been totally dependent on our local fossil fuels, we are now on track to produce 100% of our electricity from renewables by 2030. But this is not all. We learned during our previous great societal transformation, the building of our digital society, that being smart can multiply the positive impacts of transformation. So let us do things we need to do, such as phase out fossil fuels and also be smart. Let us make sustainability a core principle of education. Let us design regulations that drive green innovation. Let us build digital societies and use smart technologies in a way that support net zero efforts, tackling also digital waste. Our clean tech startup scene has some success stories to share, such as software making forestry and agriculture more sustainable, or smart solutions to improve energy efficiency. Also, let us be smart with our investments. Climate change knows no borders, and neither should our response. Often the biggest benefits for ourselves and the planet may come from the investments outside the national borders. For example, supporting the climate mitigation efforts in the Global South, the Arctic, and other areas that are burning, literally or metaphorically. It is time not to think only locally and regionally, but also globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Andrzej Duda, President of Poland. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I also thank the United Kingdom for its chairmanship of COP26. The 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Convention, which falls this year, prompts us to take stock of the climate action undertaken so far and to discuss the next steps, especially in the face of a very difficult international situation, the war in Ukraine, food and climate crisis. What has Poland done throughout these past years? It has achieved the adopted gas emissions reduction targets by 2020. It is actively developing the system of renewable energy sources, as well as the low-carbon civil nuclear power program. Poland is promoting electromobility, energy efficiency, and is developing new technologies. Our country is actively engaged in order to meet the goals set for us all. Despite challenges arising from the nature of our energy sector and industry, Poland is an example of a country following the path of sustainable development, significantly reducing emissions while growing its GDP. Ladies and gentlemen, in Poland and in the European Union, we are on the path to achieving the goals stipulated in the Climate Convention and in the Paris Agreement. For this to succeed, we all need to step up our efforts and act responsibly for the sake of socially sustainable transition. Let us remember, transition is there to serve man, not man to serve transition. As I said yesterday during our discussion of just transition, and now I'm saying this is on behalf of millions of my compatriots who are not going to ask us during the upcoming winter how many of our ambitious climate goals we have achieved. What they are going to ask is why the energy resources are so expensive and why their living standards have dropped so dramatically. Transition that puts man at the center of changes has to be cost-effective and serve energy security. By adopting the Katowice rulebook, as well as the Solidarity and Just Transition Declaration at COP24 in Poland, we have defined a framework for these actions. Today we must implement it in a consistent manner. While doing so, let us not be climate hypocrites, since it's easy for the leaders of the rich North to boast with their achievements. The world, however, has the right to ask where we have moved our production. For if we have moved it into non-European countries, then we should not forget that our responsibility has not disappeared. Since we are the ones who say that there is just one climate. Ladies and gentlemen, let me make one more point. Today, our transformation is much more difficult, among other things, due to Russia's criminal aggression against Ukraine, which has inflicted enormous human losses, caused damage to Ukraine's infrastructure, economy, and environment, losses for which the Russian perpetrators should be held accountable and which they should cover. The consequence of Russia's aggression are crisis and huge costs which put at risk timely implementation of climate transition as well as timely attainment of the intended goals. It has also generated additional emissions exceeding the level of those produced by a number of developing countries within the scope of 1 year. In the light of the above, we must provide a strong response, caring first and foremost for the people, for our compatriots, for individual energy consumers. Moreover, we must strive to ensure that the Russian aggression is promptly and permanently repealed by increasing support for Ukraine, enhancing pressure on Russia, and stepping up our efforts to become independent of Russian fossil fuels. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, today we need solidarity and concerted global action as much as ever. We need to work out innovative solutions that will ensure energy security and climate protection. Ones which, through research and development, will bring about a technological leap towards a low-carbon transition. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. I would like to remember that there is a 3-minute time for the statement during the high-level segment. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Emmerson Dambudzo Mangwana, President of Zimbabwe. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, His Excellency Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, we meet at a time when the impact of climate change continues destroying people's lives and livelihoods in every part of the world. It is opportune that this COP27 is being held on the African continent. Our voice must be heard, as too should our demands and expectations. We must unite as a continent and speak with one voice. There is need for concrete actions. Those mostly responsible for the climate crisis must listen and prioritize climate finance to help prevent disasters and climate victims recover. Commitments we have made and continue to make can only make a difference when we act on them. Mr. President, the agriculture sector, which is key to Zimbabwe's economy, is facing a serious threat from climate change. My government is implementing various programs, including extensive dam construction projects towards climate change adaptation and mitigation for sustainable food and nutrition security. Further, Zimbabwe is expanding the production and the use of renewable energy. Zimbabwe will see greenhouse gas emissions curbed to 44.7 million tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. My country has also integrated gender issues in the revised nationally determined contributions. Greater progress would be made on our climate goals were it not for the albatross of illegal economic sanctions imposed on our country. We demand the immediate lifting of these unwarranted and punitive sanctions. Zimbabwe is committed to be a friend to all and an enemy to none. And we are ready to play our part in addressing climate change and other challenges that face our world. In conclusion, Your Excellency, at this COP27, let us from the developing world act as a countermanding bloc of victims of climate change. We need to negotiate and vote as a bloc through the group of 77 plus China. Only then are we likely to carry the day. We can and must act now to secure a healthy planet for the present and the future generations. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Mokgweetsi Eric Masisi, President of Botswana. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, COP President, heads of state and government, distinguished delegates. Coming from the opposite southern slopes of Africa of similar climate to Egypt-induced limitations, our summer has barely begun and temperatures can easily climb to 40 degrees Celsius on a given day. The new normal of unpredictable patterns of rainfall is compounding unreliability of rain-fed agriculture. What used to be the Molopo River no longer loops the length of the Kalahari. The migratory flamingo no longer flock to the Makadikadi pans for the seasonal breeding in greater numbers. We've witnessed with increasing helplessness as the floodplain of the Chobe and the reach of the Okavango Delta were forced into a retreat, threatening livelihoods and calamity to the entire ecosystem meant to support the largest concentration of elephants in the wild on Earth. There is no doubt that we all acknowledge the science and warnings on climate change, but implementation of desired adaptation actions and deliverables, though a national development imperative for many of us, has thus far remained elusive and, yes, a mirage. At the recent 2022 National Adaptation Plans Expo we hosted in Gaborone, it became evident from the exchanges that the need to implement adaptation actions is increasingly becoming more urgent, not only for Botswana, but also for the rest of the vulnerable countries around the globe. Botswana has in place the climate change policy and its associated strategy and action plan. Adaptation measures within the agricultural sector includes the development of a drought-resistant crop varieties and livestock breeds more tolerable to the harsh climatic conditions. However, smart agricultural approaches and the deployment of associated technologies, including the integrated water master plan that transfers water from the north to the southern parts of the country for both drinking and for food production come at a prohibitive cost. However, our commitment to the international community remains undiminished. Within the limitation of our financial resources, Botswana intends to do more, especially through our research institutions, to provide the necessary support, given our capability and experience in the development of animal disease vaccines and disease management through the Botswana Vaccine Institute. With additional support to our research institutions, we can provide the world with some of the cutting-edge adaptation solutions, especially on agriculture and health. Drought is another permanent feature in Botswana, which continues to deplete the little resources we have for socio-economic development. This has prompted the government to develop a drought management strategy to assist in resilience building to mitigate loss and damage, as well as mobilize resources. This will, however, not be enough without innovative adaptation funding systems. I wish to urge the UNFCCC to rethink adaptation financing. For effective implementation of adaptation actions, the project-based approach will not yield the intended results. Adaptation financing, due to its long-term nature, should be embedded into the National Treasury, as it requires established institutions and systems which are not project-based. We need to rethink our adaptation financing strategy. We need to consider joining the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund to create an adaptation window that can accommodate integrated, innovative approaches to financing adaptation actions as opposed to project-based financing. On mitigation, the government of Botswana has made a decision to increase renewable energy penetration from 2% to 30% by 2030. This will double the national determined contributions targets. These efforts are in line with the energy policy and renewable energy strategy. Additional resources are pivotal to the full implementation of our integrated resource plan and on an accelerated basis. In conclusion, I wish to pledge my delegation's support to the COP presidency as you steer the debates in the direction that should deliver timely results in implementation, especially on climate finance for adaptation and mitigation measures, technology development and research. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Khugelsup Ukna, President of Mongolia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, Mr. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt. Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the government of the Arab Republic of Egypt for successfully convening the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the best wishes for successful summit and conference. The current session of the Conference of the Parties stands out for being held in Africa, which is severely affected by climate change. In these difficult times, when the world is faced with significant challenges such as global food and energy crisis, rising price and geopolitical tensions, it is imperative that all countries remain committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and intensify their actions, especially towards combating climate change without losing momentum. Soil, food, and human beings are inextricably linked. Healthy soil produces healthy food, whilst healthy food nurtures healthy people. Therefore, combating climate change is intrinsic to protecting soil, our food, and humankind. The United Nations study of 2021 reveals that about 2.3 billion, or around 30% of the global population, are moderately or severely food insecure, and 828 million people are affected by hunger. For that reason, every country needs to comprehensively address the pillars of food supply, food security, and climate change as part of sustainable development goals. Mongolia, in its efforts towards achieving sustainable development goals, is successfully implementing the food supply and security, healthy Mongolians, and Billion Trees national movements. For example, we believe that the successful implementation of the Billion Trees national movement will not only provide opportunities to increase Mongolia's forest cover and contribute to the reduction of greenhouse in the atmosphere, but will also positively affect a number of socioeconomic issues by improving soil protection, agricultural production, food supply, and safety, and employment opportunities. I am pleased to underscore that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres personally supported the movement during his visit to Mongolia. Availing myself of this opportunity, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the country's development partners and international organizations collaborating on the Billion Trees national movement. It is my pleasure to announce that Mongolia has become the first country in Asia to cooperate with the European Union within the framework of Forest Partnership Program. Mongolia is one of the countries most affected by climate change. Although it emits only 0.1% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions, its per capita and per GDP unit emissions are relatively higher than the world average. In this regard, our country has set an ambitiously raised target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 27.2%, which is a high indicator for Mongolia. The largest sources of Mongolia's greenhouse gas emissions are energy, agriculture, and industrial sectors. Mongolia has a huge renewable energy resource estimated at 2,600 gigawatts thanks to its geographical location and climatic conditions. This indicates that Mongolia has a potential to increase its renewable energy production, further contributing to the energy supply of the region. Currently, the portion of renewable energy reached 18.2% of Mongolia's total available installed energy capacity. This share planned to be increased to 30% by 2030. At present, 75% of her households in Mongolia use renewable energy. We are actively cooperating with international organizations and countries in the region to increase the use of renewable energy sources, including quite new ones like hydrogen. Furthermore, Mongolia has recently joined the Global Methane Pledge, paying particular attention to methane emissions as part of greenhouse gas emission reduction measures. Mongolia is endeavoring to achieve carbon neutrality around by the mid of this century, as enhancing reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration while strengthening its capacity on climate resilience. Climate change, coupled with the negative effect of human activities, it's exacerbating biodiversity loss, land degradation, and desertification. In this regard, it is my pleasure to inform you that Mongolia is preparing to host the 17th Conference of the Parties to the Convention to Combat Desertification in 2026. Bilateral and multilateral cooperation mechanisms of the three Rio Conventions and in particular the global carbon market regulated by Article 6 of the Paris Agreement should be effectively used as instruments for climate change mitigation. Accordingly, developing countries will have more opportunities to spur innovation through technology transfer and increase their access to green financing, successfully overcome the challenges, and achieve their goals. From this honorable podium, I would like to reiterate Mongolia's willingness to foster open, effective, and mutually beneficial cooperation with every country in the world, international organizations, and development partners. In conclusion, I am pleased to emphasize that our bold decisions, mutual understanding, and collaboration, as well as our perseverance, are crucial to reaching our climate change targets in adequate time frame and achieving sustainable development. Remembering that Mother Earth is our home and Mother Nature is the source of our existence, let us work together with a common goal for the well-being of the present and future generations. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, President of Sri Lanka. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
The Chairperson, Excellencies, Delegates, the salubrious environment of the green city of Sharm el-Sheikh will undoubtedly inspire our discussions at COP27 to a successful conclusion. I sincerely thank the Government of Egypt for your warm welcome and hospitality. Mr. Chairman, in order to make my speech brief, I will eliminate the achievements of Sri Lanka in regard to climate change, which will certainly be included in the written speeches. There's only one issue that I refer to in Sri Lanka. Yet for climate action to be successful, wide-ranging measures to complement the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement must be pursued. The lack of capacity is the biggest obstacle to the implementation of climate action plans. Therefore, capacity building is vital in this regard. To overcome this obstacle, we propose to establish an international climate change university in Sri Lanka with an ancillary institute in Maldives that will be the first of its type. This seat of learning can be a transdisciplinary global center for green and blue studies, for scientists, environmentalists, researchers, policymakers, development practitioners, and of course, students the world over to interchange knowledge transcending national and disciplinary boundaries. The envisaged Climate Change University will offer both short-term courses and postgraduate academic awards to build capabilities on the mitigating and adapting to climate change. The university will also expedite the skills of the new generations to deliver the political, economic, social, cultural, and digital transformation required to prevent a 1.5 centigrade world. It would be the vehicle to enlighten climate change challenges and prospects domestically. The collaboration of multilateral institutions and organizations such as the Commonwealth, World Bank, and the ADB, amongst others, will be sought for the establishment of the Institute of Higher Learning, making it a multi-stakeholder partnership transcending national boundaries. It's my hope that Sri Lanka's proposal will receive extensive support and endorsement from the international community. Since the prescription for addressing climate change have to be dispensed in the global domain, we will meet again next year, charged with high hopes. However, the checkered implementation of previous decisions, including those of COP26, is extremely disheartening. Regrettably, the ground reality is that the fossil fuel-based industrialized countries of G7 and G20, who have been the main promoters of green hydrogen, are now backtracking to use fossil fuel. In the last year, carbon dioxide emissions increased by 2 billion metric tons, from 3.3 billion to 36.3 billion metric tons. Such double standards are unacceptable. Developed nations should be giving leadership to overcome climate challenges rather than abdicating their responsibilities. It is no secret that climate financing has missed the target. It's ironic that the $100 billion pledged annually have not been available in the coffers to finance climate challenges, as many developed nations deem it fit to renege on their climate financing contributions. These countries, who are also on both sides of the Ukraine war, seem to have no qualms spending for a war which will finally exceed $350 billion, a conflict waged purportedly for security interests of the combatants. The only security at stake is food insecurity, exacerbated to levels not experienced before the war. Many living both in the developed and the developing world are outside the scope of three meals a day. It is estimated that between 30 to 40 million people are being driven into hunger, especially in Africa. This war has also resulted in the upward spiraling cost of living, shortages of oil and gas supplies, and it has brought the fight against hunger to our homes. Expectedly, it has led to the curtailing of much required climate financing pledged by these very same countries. The issue we have is not of finding the party responsible for the war, but the party that will end the war. Why do we need this funding? It is known fact that the practice of colonialism transferred the rich resources of Asia and Africa to Europe and were used to industrialize their countries. We became poor from this plunder. This unbridled industrialization of the developed economies is also the root cause of climate change, the consequence of which we, the poor countries, are forced to suffer. Our problems are augmented due to the absence of adequate funding. Therefore, those in South are facing a double jeopardy, struggling to develop economically while fighting to protect the living standards of our population. It is therefore imperative that the developed countries deliver on their pledges in Glasgow by doubling their funding. Adding insult to injury, damages caused by extreme weather conditions are increasing, and their impact exceedingly costly. Developing countries who are the worst affected by the rise in emission from industrial world need to be compensated for loss and damage. Considering the failure of the developed world in bringing about the much-discussed relief, it is proposed that before we get to Dubai for COP28, like-minded nations should meet at ministerial level to discuss the way forward on all aspects of climate financing. This should be followed with the meeting of the heads of government of these countries on the margins of COP28 to display a collective frame of mind to stave off calamity. In conclusion, let me recall the UN Secretary General's recent word that the choice is between collective action or collective suicide. The vacuum created due to inaction now requires the global display of sustained political will by dynamic action and constructive cooperation on the part of like-minded countries to prevent this catastrophe. Let us traverse this path urgently. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Chairperson, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, we are gathered here for COP27 on an African continent that is experiencing the worsening effects of climate change. For the sake of our continent and the world, we need a dramatic increase in global mitigation, an ambition to keep the world on the 1.5-degree pathway. Like other vulnerable regions, Africa needs to build adaptive capacity, foster resilience, and address loss and damage, as we agreed at Paris COP21. Chairperson, in order to achieve this, our continent will need a predictable, appropriate, and at-scale funding stream and technological support. This must support our right to development, international equity, and transmissions that are just and inclusive. This then places a great deal of responsibility on developed economies to honor their commitments to those countries with the greatest need and countries that confront the greatest environmental, social, and economic effects of climate change. The commitments that were made must be honored, because failing to honor these commitments breaks trust and confidence in the process. At present, we also have another challenge in relation to funding institutions. Funding institutions need to transform and change the way in which they fund projects that will enable us to develop with regard to climate change. Multilateral development banks, as well as other funding institutions, need to transform. At present, multilateral support is out of reach of the majority of the world's population due to lending policies that are risk-averse and carry onerous costs, as well as conditionalities. We need a clear roadmap to deliver on the Glasgow decision to double adaptation financing by 2025. Our emphasis must be on the health, well-being, and food and water security of the most vulnerable people in the world. At a national level, South Africa is fully committed to achieving the most ambitious end of the mitigation range in our updated nationally determined contribution. As a country, we are guided by a just transition framework and an investment plan that outlines the enormous scale and nature of investments that are needed to achieve our decarbonization goals over the next 5 years. We are already scaling up investment in renewable energy and are on a course to retire a number of aging coal-fired power stations. At COP26 in Glasgow last year, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union offered support in the form of a just energy transition partnership to South Africa. It is our hope that this partnership will offer a groundbreaking approach to funding by developed economy countries for the ambitious but necessary mitigation and adaptation goals of a number of developing countries. South Africa is hopeful that the commitments that were made to put effect to this partnership will be met. And we have already said the amounts of money that are needed for South Africa to embark on this difficult journey are close on to $90 trillion. And we have said that the categorization of the funding needs to be well packaged so that there is meaningful grants, meaningful concessional loans, and investments by a variety of institutions. We are grateful and would like to pay our tribute and support for the Egyptian presidency and its confidence in the successful outcomes of COP27. We're grateful to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Evariste Ndayishimiye, President of Burundi. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Excellencies, President of COP27, heads of government, heads of state, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, may I thank God Almighty, thanks to whom we've been able to come here to Sharm el-Sheikh in good health, and this to take part in the 27th Conference of the Parties, namely the COP27, on behalf of the government and the people of Burundi. And on my own behalf, I would like to thank the government and especially the President of the Arab Republic, the Egyptian Arab Republic, my brother Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. I would like to thank also the government and the people of Egypt, and more specifically, I would like to thank the people of this beautiful town of Sharm el-Sheikh for this very warm welcome afforded not only me, but also my delegation. Ladies and gentlemen, financing for the implementation of Burundi's nationally determined contribution, these financing falls broadly short of what we need to finance what we want to see change. They are piecemeal, these financings, and compartmentalized and issued by a number of international agencies, and they have no real long-term effect for our communities and for Burundi's resilience as we seek to combat climate change. What matters today for Burundi is for us to meet the challenge of re-establishing our forest cover and to combat the relentless degradation of our forests, whilst at the same time meeting our food security needs and our legitimate aspirations to bring about agricultural and industrial development. And to achieve this, we need to produce more food and timber on existing land in order to reduce how much we resort or to reduce demand for new land, which we simply do not have. Burundi, therefore, wishes to foster investment in large-scale solutions, and this by investing in proven models which can be replicated and have a truly transformational impact. Now is no longer the time for us to finance pilot projects, but rather to accelerate now deployment of projects at large-scale deployment of projects. This is the case of the Kivu and the Tanganyika lakes in Burundi. Labor-intensive production and processing of commodities yields huge development dividends. Needless to say, this aim to do more of this is all the more so important today, given the growing interest in people's growing interest in the link between stability, food security, climate change, and biodiversity. And this has been triggered by recent extreme climate events, the war in Ukraine, and international markets' growing need for zero deforestation certification. Now, if you look at the solutions put forward, you will find the issuing of sovereign bonds to fund portfolios of projects that meet predefined criteria, and this through long-term and low-interest loans, as well as performance payments of the environmental services payment kinds, PSCs in French. Burundi therefore appeals to the United Nations agencies and to the international financial institutions to create these kinds of innovative financial mechanisms, such as the FPBs, the Forest Performance Bonds, which are tailored to regional contexts and tailored to the level of risk as analyzed by capital markets. These mechanisms should combine green bonds market mechanisms and large-scale financial guarantees and performance-based payment models, which all work in the the framework established by UNFCCC. Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, it would be remiss of me to conclude without reiterating our thanks to all the organizers of COP27, and our thanks to the host country, and our thanks to all the partners who've contributed to the success of this conference taking place on African soil. May God bless you, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Rumen Georgi Radev, President of Bulgaria. Your Excellency, you have the floor. Okay, sorry, I apologize for that. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Assoumani Hassali, President of Comoros. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellence.
His Excellency Mr. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt and dear brother, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Majesties, Your Highnesses, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure for me and for my delegation to take part in this important meeting, COP27, in this beautiful, superb coastal resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. At the outset, I would like to restate my sincere thanks to my brother, His Excellency Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, for the very warm welcome that we have received, as well as the hospitality that we have received and receive indeed every time we set foot in this great and beautiful kindred country. I also extend my most sincere thanks to the Secretary General of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for the excellent organization of this conference. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset of this speech, let me quote the former French President Jacques Chirac. He said, "Our house is burning and we are looking elsewhere." He said that in September 2002 during the Earth Summit in Johannesburg in South Africa. 20 years later, this urgent warning remains highly relevant. COP27 this year is taking place in a context of significant global crises that of course require determination and collective commitment that is even higher in order to meet these challenges. We have the effects of the health crisis connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have the war in Ukraine that has caused the prices of food and energy to reach unprecedented levels. And this in itself could lead to an unbearable food crisis at international level. Meanwhile, there have been climate and weather phenomena that are feeding this uncertainty around the world. We've seen record levels of rain, of heat, of drought, and fires and storms. Asia has seen catastrophic climate phenomena, and this is illustrated by the most recent disaster that significantly affected a kindred country in Pakistan. Floods and storms in Africa in the first half of 2022 caused the loss of life of hundreds of people and severely disturbed economic activity. Millions of people are suffering hunger in the Horn of Africa because of severe drought. Europe is also seeing the worst drought in recent decades, as well as terrible heat waves. The United States is also seeing violent tornadoes and other floods that have disastrous consequences. I send my compassion to all of these kindred countries and friends affected by these disasters and who are confronted by the deleterious effects of climate change. It is important to underscore that in small island developing states, these climate and weather phenomena, severe as they are, threaten the very existence of these countries. They impede their economic development and prevent their populations from thriving. By way of example, I'd like to mention the Kenneth cyclone. This devastated the Comores in April 2019. It caused loss of human life, hundreds of people were injured, others were severely affected, there was huge material damage, indeed damage that we are still trying to repair more than 3 years later. It is therefore essential that we have coordinated global action that is up to facing the most significant challenges that humanity is confronted with. Distinguished guests, we all know the extent to which our planet is suffering from climate change. Therefore, this conference should represent an opportunity for us to step up in the effective implementation of international climate action, and in particular, in supporting any initiative that would finally enable us to move from ambition to action. During the COP26 conference in Glasgow last year, one of the main questions was looking at the way in which countries respond to the need for financing in order to address the impact of climate change that are so serious that the communities affected by them are simply unable to adapt to them. It was therefore a question of creating a financing mechanism to deal with loss and damage. In the framework of the Convention, we should prolong and even consolidate the trend that had began at that COP conference. Therefore, I hope to see greater commitment and solidarity so that we can make even more significant advances, in particular in creating supplementary financing earmarked for these examples of loss and damage. But as we all know, we cannot face the challenge of climate change without the necessary adaptation and mitigation measures, which is why we must concentrate on the clear and quick identification of global priorities in this area. It is by urgently reinforcing the implementation of mitigation measures during the course of this decade that we will be able to keep alive the objective of 1.5 degrees. Thinking in particular about my own country, initiatives have been undertaken so that the country remains a carbon sink. This is why it is our ambition to make use of the immense potential that the country has, in particular in terms of photovoltaic, geothermal, water and wind energy. We have made this one of our priorities. Photovoltaic projects have been carried out and talks are underway to quickly launch a project for developing geothermal energy. We've also adopted a reforestation policy entitled One Comorian, One Tree. This is at work throughout the countryside, and also we're developing protected areas that will cover more than 50% of our national territory, while also reforesting drainage basins. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before concluding, may I recall that in order for our fight against climate change to be successful, we have to ensure that adaptation becomes a reality. Developed countries must make significant progress in providing the $100 billion a year stipulated in the Paris Agreement, given that at the moment the real sum that is being transferred is less than 50% of that goal. In this context, my country supports the legitimate demands of the African group and small island developing states in favor of doubling adaptation financing by 2025. We must also bear in mind, finally, that capacity building continues to be a cornerstone of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I wish every success as well to our kindred country, the United Arab Emirates, when it holds COP28 next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Rumen Georgiev Radev, President of Bulgaria. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me first extend my sincere appreciation to President El-Sisi for the excellent organization and warm hospitality, and to President Shukri for the constructive dialogue. COP27 is taking place in dramatic times, marked by deteriorated security environment and increased geopolitical challenges induced by the war in Ukraine, severe energy, economic and social crisis. We should not, however, let all those crises derail our joint determination to fight the climate change, particularly having in mind the many recent unprecedented climate disasters. The most reliable scientific sources clearly show that the climate-resilient development is put at risk under the current global warming levels. We must unite our efforts and use the time we still have to avert the worst effects on the climate change. Climate change is a global threat and can only be addressed by a global response. Bulgaria is strongly committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. My country will jointly deliver, together with the other EU member states, the goal of climate neutrality by 2050. Bulgaria's greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 decreased by 57% compared to the base year. We overachieved our national target on the share of energy from renewable sources in the gross final energy consumption by 7%, with a share of 23% in 2020. Diversification of energy supply is crucial, and my country has already increased its efforts to ensure better interconnectivity with neighboring states. The interconnector Greece-Bulgaria, which was inaugurated on October this year, significantly strengthens the security of gas supply not only for Bulgaria, but for the whole region of Southeast Europe and beyond. Ensuring just transition involves enhanced technologies and systemic innovation across all sectors. Bulgaria will further develop and rely on renewable energy, green hydrogen solutions, and energy-saving and energy-storing technologies. Scaling up global mitigation ambition is not enough. The mitigation work program is an instrument to address both the ambition and the implementation gap through increased action by all stakeholders, revision and transition to economy-wide targets. We need to broaden and strengthen the adaptation agenda, and the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation will allow us to do so. The transition towards a resource-efficient, green and low-carbon economy requires significant interaction between policies, investments, science and public sector. General transformation is only possible with the involvement of the private and financial sectors, and is expected to provide an important opportunity for sustainable development. And finally, given our commitment to advancing the climate agenda in our region and beyond, Bulgaria has already indicated willingness to host COP29. We will reach out our partners to shape a motivated proposal with this regard. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mohamed Menfi, President of Libya. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Your Majesties, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to His Excellency President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of the Arab Republic of Egypt for the excellent organization and hospitality on the safe and secure land of Egypt. Egypt is hosting at present COP27 at a time when the world is sliding further towards division, while the environmental risk reminds us that humanity is facing common challenges that requires rejecting differences and acting as one in order to save lives on the planet Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the political crisis Libya is going through that requires focused internal efforts and domestic work, we can only be part of this world. The Presidential Council of Libya, as part of its international obligations towards environment and climate, migration and economy, peace and security, it is indeed sending a message to the whole world about the form of the state that we are aspiring to build, a nation state, a civil state that opens up to the world and that is committed to international instruments and treaties, central to which the climate treaties and instruments. The Presidential Council of Libya has been participating in these instruments over the past 2 years. As we recognize the risk of climate change, we need to deepen this understanding so that it would be closely connected with the cultural, economic, and existential challenges that we are going through. Climate change undermines the opportunities of development and investment and curbs economic growth, particularly in the developing countries that are rent-based and agriculture-based. And that is due to the difficulty to make up for the lost natural resources as a consequence of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, contrary to what many believe, Libya has been one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Scarce rainfall and reduced water resources over the past few years is a presage to severe droughts that are accelerating at present due to the fact that the soil is becoming more saline and dry, and the topsoil is getting lost, in addition to the evaporation of surface water. And that is because of rising temperatures and desertification, in addition to the retraction of plant cover, which has an impact on the pastoral activities and the food production qualitatively and quantitatively. Libya is also one of the most threatened countries by rising sea water, as Libya has the longest coastline in the Mediterranean Sea with over 1,770 kilometers, which is home to more than 95% of the Libyan population. Despite the political transition in Libya, we have not been idle. We have activated the National Committee for Climate Change and raised awareness about further engagement with the international community so as to mitigate the impacts, the negative impacts of climate change at the social, economic, and environmental levels. We also participated in COP26 in Glasgow to push forward negotiations on keeping 1.5 Celsius alive. Libya has also been one of the countries that ratified the Paris Agreement in 2015. Libya, ladies and gentlemen, is aspiring to restore its active role at the regional and international levels, fulfilling its obligations, moving forward towards achieving sustainable development goals in order to ensure dignified life to the generations to come and maintain its depleting resources and the environment. May God help us reaching our aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Lazarus McCarthy Chakwera, President of Malawi. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, Dr. Sameh Shukri, President of COP27, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. This African COP is a test for all of us. It is a test of our mettle as leaders. It is a test of our ability to deliver climate justice for the most vulnerable nations. It is a test of our resolve to mobilize climate financing for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. It is a test of our capacity to work together as a global community that is sailing into the same storm in the same boat. To pass this test of leadership, we need to go beyond the Berlin budgets of COP1, the Stockholm statements of COP2, the Kyoto protocols of COP3, and the calls and commitments we have all made between COP4 in Buenos Aires and COP26 in Glasgow. To pass this test of leadership, we need to act with courage, urgency, and solidarity. We must act with courage by doing what we said we would do. We must act with the same courage all of you have showed by showing up here in Sharm el-Sheikh. I believe I speak for all of you when I say that the temptation to abstain from COP this year was great, not only because it is discouraging to see how behind we are still on mitigation, adaptation, and financing. It was also tempting for each of you to abstain from this COP because of the great and unprecedented economic hardships your citizens are suffering in your own nation, hardships all of our nations are facing from the high global demand and low supply in jobs, fuel, fertilizer, and food. But you resisted this temptation and chose the path of courage, the courage to show up here because you know that it is folly to try to solve a problem on your own, that you can only be solved together. Now you must show that same courage by doing what you already pledged to do in climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and climate financing. I also said we must act with urgency, and the reason for this is simple. We are running out of time. The key to addressing climate change is sustainable development and restoring balance to our relationship with nature. But nature is losing its patience with us and lashing out with unrelenting vengeance. And as nature lashes out, our citizens are also losing their patience. We must act now, not later. We must act today, not tomorrow. And lastly, we must act with solidarity. That means remembering our common humanity in the measures we put in place. If we do not, we will not treat the suffering of other nations as a matter of agency. And to turn a blind eye to that suffering is to do harm to our own humanity. For what is to be human if not to identify with the plight of others simply because you too are human and know what it is to suffer? What is to be human if not to fight for each other so that everyone has a fair chance? A fair chance, the kind of fairness that is about equity and not equality. We are all equal in value before God, but our obligations, our capacities, our opportunities, and our offenses vary. And equity and fairness demand that none of us should set benchmarks for ourselves that we know are so low that they perpetuate a legacy of unfairness against others. In a fair system, the benchmarks for climate mitigation, adaptation, and financing for developed nations like the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Norway, Japan, and Russia cannot be the same as the benchmarks for developing nations like Malawi, Mozambique, and Madagascar, just as the benchmarks for those low-income and low-productivity countries cannot be the same as the benchmarks for a high-income and high-productivity country like China. So as Malawi, we believe that the clear difference in capability and capacity between developed nations must be reflected in the level of responsibility they bear for climate mitigation, adaptation, and financing. And similarly, we believe that the clear difference in capability and capacity between developed nations must be reflected in the resources they access for mitigation, adaptation, and financing. That is fairness. That is justice. That is solidarity. And as we say in Malawi, that is Ubuntu. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Alexander van der Bellen, President of Austria. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear representatives of the civil society. In 2015, at COP21, we adopted the Paris Agreement, a common goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Dear colleagues, let us be honest. We are far from reaching the 1.5 goal. In fact, the opposite is happening. Global CO2 emissions rapidly rebounded following the COVID-19 pandemic. And all around the world, we are experiencing the devastating consequences of the climate emergency. Large parts of the global south, of which Egypt is also a representative, are hit particularly hard by the effects of the climate crisis. Rightfully so, the most affected countries demand financial support for climate adaptation, as well as measures to address loss and damages. We, the countries of the global north, are responsible for a large part of global CO2 emissions. Austria, my home country, will assume its responsibility by significantly increasing its budget for international climate finance. In the upcoming years, the period from 2023 to 2026, the Ministry for Climate Action will allocate an additional 220 million euros to international climate finance. For me, as the Austrian president, it was important that my country shows solidarity. We want to do our part to save the world's rainforests from disappearing, to protect our oceans and its incredible marine life, and to support the resilience of our most vulnerable communities. However, However, we cannot and should not limit ourselves to the question of climate finance. Because one thing is clear, we cannot buy ourselves out of the climate emergency. Money alone won't make our air cleaner. It won't stop Earth from warming up, and it won't prevent the glaciers from melting. Austria aims to become climate neutral by 2040. Many other countries have set themselves similar goals. But these goals must be backed up by concrete measures. Otherwise, they're just blah, blah, as Greta Thunberg would say. Indeed, when we look at the UNEP report, it is obvious that there is far too much blah, blah and far too little concrete action. I understand Greta's criticism. I understand that young people, and not only young people, are running out of patience. It is up to us to do everything we can to regain trust through concrete action and through commitments, but binding commitments. Austria is expanding renewable energies. We are phasing out the installation of fossil fuel heating systems. We are investing record sums in public transport. These are steps in the right direction, but we need to do much more, much faster. All of us, no matter from which country, political party, or institution we are coming from, must ask ourselves every day, how can we do even better? We must do everything we can to ensure a livable future on this beautiful planet for generations to come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of Ghana. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the government and people of the Arab Republic of Egypt, for their warmth of hospitality to the Ghanaian delegation since our arrival in this ancient historic country, and express our appreciation to the President for hosting this all-important Conference of Parties, COP27, the fifth such on African soil, which has been so well organized. Today, extreme climate occurrences such as severe precipitation and floods, prolonged drought, and heat waves are happening all over the world, both in the developed and developing worlds. Climate change is a global emergency, and Ghana calls on all parties to act with equity and a sense of responsibility. Africa, for her part, must commit herself to resolve the issues of climate change by implementing ambitious measures within her reach. With her vast land, Africa has the greatest potential to help decarbonize the world by absorbing carbon dioxide through regenerative agriculture that requires less fertilizers and reforestation with strong biodiversity content. My government is happy to announce that Ghana is about to launch projects in these areas, which will tackle at the same time climate change at global and domestic levels and social issues by providing people with dignified and sustainable jobs. And I'm also happy to announce that Ghana has launched her Energy Transition Framework and is co-chair of the Forest Climate Leaders Partnership with the United States of America. As chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, I'm also delighted by the announcement made by the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, the respected Kristalina Georgieva, on the operationalization of the IMF's Resilience and Sustainable Trust to help vulnerable countries meet their long-term challenges. As adaptation costs continue to outstrip current international public finance flows, we must, as a matter of urgency, mobilize and scale up adaptation finance inflows to ensure that vulnerable countries are able to meet their adaptation needs. It is critical in this regard that the developed world makes good its long-delayed pledge to mobilize and make available $100 billion annually to the poorer countries to assist in the fight against climate change, and commit, as agreed at COP26 in Glasgow, to doubling resources for adaptation. Furthermore, it is plain to most that a radical restructuring of the global financial architecture, as proposed by the African finance ministers, to accommodate the demands of the developing world is of urgent necessity. It is evident that with these polycrises, that it is not fit for purpose. And I also urge those who hold African debt to commit to debt for climate swap initiatives. I'm telling all partners, take a better look at Africa and see her for what she is, a land of opportunities and growth. I know this may sound unrealistic, taking into consideration the dire situation most of the continent finds itself in today, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But as far as adaptation to climate change is concerned, nothing can succeed without Africa. With her vast arable land, vibrant youth who aspire only to take their rightful place on the global scene, and a deeply rooted sense of innovation, Africa has a massive role to play. It is Ghana's hope that we will leave this summit with bold and concrete decisions that will help the world tackle its most pressing challenges, help us achieve our climate goals rapidly, and provide the needed development and prosperity for all the peoples of the world. No one will win if Africa loses. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Nikos Anastasiades, President of Cyprus. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's attention is focused on our deliberations here in Sharm el-Sheikh, given the gravity of the decisions to be reached for the future of our planet, I take the opportunity to express my deepest appreciation to the government of the Arab Republic of Egypt for hosting and steering the work of COP27. This is an implementation summit and an African COP concerning on the climate-related changes of this continent. I'm delighted that this COP is hosted by our strategic partner Egypt, and I would like to assure His Excellency the President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, of my of my country's full support in his noble endeavor. Ladies and gentlemen, numerous scientific reports, including the IPCC report, send out the clear and stark message that only the most strategic cuts in carbon emissions would help prevent an environmental disaster from rising temperature. We must rise to these challenges, acting collectively, decisively, and with greater urgency and ambition so as to avoid the worst consequences of a rapidly warming planet. Excellencies, Cyprus is a Mediterranean island state located in a region that is already experienced the impact of climate change. Prolonged periods of droughts and increased temperatures have been threatening our forests and ecosystems, affecting people and livelihoods, which means that demanding an urgent national response. We started the implementation of our national adaptation strategy back in 2017 and are currently in the process of updating the strategy with the aim of advance from the current modalities of incremental adjustment to a planned and systematic approach that can better address the multiple, complex, and interlinked climate change risks and impacts. Notwithstanding the size of our country and our small carbon footprint, we are committed in contributing to carbon emissions reductions. We have collectively, with the European Union framework and with the other member states, submitted a significantly enhanced nationally determined contribution in 2020 with a commitment of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to levels in 1990. The EU and its member states remain steadfast in their commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 through a legally binding climate law. Both ambition and implementation are essential in this critical decade to ensure the credibility of us to the Paris Agreement and reach the goal of climate neutrality in a sustainable way. At national level now, we revisited and revised our national policies to make them fit for purpose, to achieve the more ambitious target for 2030 and started the implementation of our long-term strategy towards climate neutrality by 2050. Excellencies, dear friends, distinguished friends, we look forward to the adoption of a comprehensive Sharm el-Sheikh outcome that will ensure an ambitious global response to climate change. Building on the Glasgow Climate Pact, we welcome the establishment of a mitigation work program that aims at enhancing accountability and encouraging ambition and implementation. We will actively engage with the EU framework in the two-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience and reduce vulnerabilities in order to protect people, livelihoods, and ecosystems. Distinguished friends, in recognition of the significant impact of climate change, specifically in our region, necessitating collaborative action for addressing its negative consequences, we launched the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East Climate Change Initiative in 2018. The initiative led to the development of a regional action, an action plan consisting of regionally appropriate policies and measures based on the specific findings of our region's top scientists brought together by the initiative to develop solutions to our shared problems that will practically achievable and have ensuring benefits for our citizens. Our action plan was endorsed a while ago at a side event hosted by the President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, during which the nations of our region adopted a relevant political declaration which marked the official practical launching and implementation of the said initiative and action plan. Distinguished friends, I would like to end by acknowledging the important role of the youth. Young people's voices have been instrumental in galvanizing action for a more ambitious climate agenda. We are hearing and we are responding to this clear, demanding action so as to be able to look to the future with optimism. Let us respond. Let us all walk the road towards climate neutrality, towards a future of green, sustainable, resilient economies and societies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, United States, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, President of the 27th Conference of Parties, Minister Sami Shukri, distinguished delegates. First, I express my appreciation to President Sisi and the government and the people of the Arab Republic of Egypt for hosting us in beautiful Sharm el-Sheikh. The findings of the 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change show that a more sustainable future remains within our reach. Yet, despite growing evidence that the damage of global warming will soon become irreversible, there seems to be little sense of urgency. Rwanda, like the rest of Africa, is ready to prioritize renewable energy. We do this for our own future. The point is not to generate carbon credits so that others can continue using coal, even as Africa is discouraged from exploiting its fossil fuel resources. The most valuable contribution that developed countries can make is to reduce their emissions faster while investing with Africa to build sustainable green power. Questioning whether Africa is ready to make use of climate finance should not be used as an excuse to justify inaction. We have seen the effects of this thinking during the pandemic. Vulnerable nations cannot rely on external financing alone. We need public-private partnerships. This is why Rwanda has launched Ireme Invest, a new green investment facility with over $100 million from US dollars from domestic and international partners. I congratulate all countries that have ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, most recently the United States, and encourage others to do so. Instruments such as the Commonwealth's Blue Charter and Living Lands Charter are also valuable tools, especially for small island and developing states. Rwanda remains committed to inclusive and transparent negotiations for a green and climate resilient future. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Nicolás Maduro Moros, President of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Buenos días a todos.
Good afternoon to you all, everyone present here in this room. We have traveled 10,407 kilometers to be here from Venezuela in the South American continent to this town of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt to bring to you our truth and to also bring a solidarity-based greeting and a greeting full of commitment from the people of Venezuela to all the countries and peoples of the world, and in particular to the President of the Republic of Egypt, Mr. Al-Sisi, and the people of Egypt who have organized this wonderful conference to combat climate change. In the world, climate imbalance is affecting the world, and it would appear from what we see that climate change, so-called climate change, it's a euphemism, in fact, because climate change is irreversible. Many elites have denied it. And yet the scientific community very early on warned about it. Almost all of the social movements also warned about it. What is happening is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The greatest environmental crisis that has occurred since the beginning of humanity is now with us. The climate crisis is a uncircumventable reality which can only be combated with concrete and urgent and immediate action. It is painful to have to admit also that the scale of this crisis is not taking us by surprise. From the start of environmental diplomacy, we had at that time enough data to declare an early emergency, and we had time to act in consequence. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was 30 years ago with the historic Kyoto Agreement. Since 1991, we have achieved great consensus on reducing carbon emissions. Up until 2009, we were doing well. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was designed to improve mechanisms to force countries, so-called developed countries of the capitalistic North, to reduce their impact on global warming, and especially to make commitments binding. We must also say, though, that we are painfully bogged down. 2009, for example, in Copenhagen, that was a failure that showed us how unwilling the negationist elites were to react to the emergency facing us. We still remember Copenhagen. We still remember police brutality, repression in the streets against the social movements, and what happened since then. Mr. President, we have wasted a lot of time since then. Every hour, every month, every year, we have been inactive, we have hesitated, we've been passive, and as a result of this, today we have ecosystems that lie destroyed. We have species that are extinct, and the living conditions on the planet have deteriorated. And yet the planet had given us all we needed for life generously, and yet today we're having to pay this great toil because of the abuse of the planet. The civilizing processes have been damaging our planet, and yesterday the threat was climate change. Today the threat is the total collapse of our ecosystem. This is what we are facing. This is appears to be our fatal destiny. The most up-to-date projections prove this. If we continue at this self-destructing pace, within 30 or 40 years, our planet will be uninhabitable. This climate crisis, we all know, has and will have definitive consequences on our planet, as a result of which we need to change our consuming patterns. According to the UN report on climate change, involving 14,000 scientists in the world, warned that if we do not reduce emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2, methane, and other GHGs by 50%, the harm will be irreversible in 8 years only. In other words, by 2030, we will have reached a point of no return with regards to hurricanes, extreme heat, which changes the living conditions and also jeopardizes our own existence. Global warming is killing the species of the world, and this seems to be unstoppable. Just to give you an example that you all are familiar with, extreme heat could be extinguishing bees, without whom we will no longer have pollination cycles, without which plants cannot reproduce, and this would reduce the levels of oxygen in the atmosphere of our planet. The average world temperature over the last 100 years has gone up by 0.8 centigrades, and it is expected that in the next 5 years it will be increased by 1.7 centigrades. Greenhouse gases are at their highest level ever. In 2021, with the reawakening of our industries post the lockdowns of COVID, we became worse than 2019, when it was 12% greater than 2010 and 50% more than what was happening in 1990. In 32 years, there's been an increase that should be recorded the worst recorded in centuries. The consequences have been on droughts, extreme rain. Around 80% of natural disasters between 2001 and 2021 occurred because of droughts or because of floods or flooding downpours. This is according to climate experts' estimations. Now, they estimate that by 2050, the Arctic oceans will be virtually ice-free for the first time in the history of the world, with a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius, which means that we're likely to lose 99% of the world's coral reefs. Similarly, the sea levels have risen by 23 centimeters since the 1980s, and almost half of these 23 centimeters. And that has happened, half of that in the last 25 years. Every year, according to the scientists, the sea rises by 3.4 centimeters, as a result of which drinking water is becoming salty water, as a result of which our water resources are becoming worse and jeopardizing the lives of thousands of people in the world, of lots of people in the world. To a great extent, man is responsible for this, but that's not enough to say. And we would be hypocrites if we did not say also that this civilization we live in is totally unequal. It is made up, this civilization, of countries that have been exploiting for 200 years indiscriminately the natural resources of the planet. At the same time, others barely have enough to feed themselves and live according to pre-industrial production modes. There is equality worldwide. Venezuela is responsible for less than 0.4% of world emissions of greenhouse gases. Notwithstanding this, our people must pay the consequences of this imbalance created by the main capitalist economies of the world, who have contaminated and continue to contaminate the planet for the benefit of just a few. The existence as we know it has been there's an upheaval in our existence for us and the species of the world. To date, biodiversity and its degradation is accelerating, and this is alarming, as Fidel Castro Russo warned in that very famous speech he gave in Rio de Janeiro 30 years ago in the Rio Summit. And I quote, "Species are going to disappear because of this, and because of the degradation of their living conditions. Man is responsible." And Fidel Castro added, "Tomorrow will be too late for us to do what we should have done a long time ago." He was attributing in 1992 responsibility to savage capitalism. It would be useless. Any effort we do would be useless if we do not have the courage to acknowledge that this is the cause of the disaster before us, namely capitalism that only destroys. In 2009 in Copenhagen, Hugo Chávez Frías was brave enough to say so that morning directly. And I would like to recall his quote at the time in Copenhagen in 2009. "What is the cause of climate change? The cause is the dream of seeking to find happiness in accumulating possessions, using techniques that can be used to exploit indefinitely the resources of the world. Let us not change climate. Let us change the system." End of quote. This was 2009, Hugo Chávez in Copenhagen. Mr. President, imbalance and crises are tantamount to injustice, social and economic injustice created by capitalism worldwide, a system that normalizes exploitation of human beings, and this is simply not ethical and does not respect other forms of existence. Capitalism sees resources where other cultures see life and what is sacred. The people think they have a right to grab and own and destroy anything that stands in their way to accumulate, a way of accumulating capital. We need, in this summit, to achieve agreements based on action to face the structural problems, but we must also design now a concrete agenda to protect populations that are vulnerable in the world. Humanity cannot continue to become an orphan. We need, without any postponement, without any delay, without any red tape, we need to put together the loss and damage fund we have been speaking about for years now in previous COPs. And to achieve this, we need to iron out every single final detail and establish a mechanism so that we can provide funding which is fair, timely and expeditious, so that financing reaches the most effective so the financing can reach the most affected peoples. We must tackle the root of the problem here today, and we must provide succor for the most vulnerable of the world. The crime chasm between peoples has increased and made deeper over the last decades as we have destroyed the planet. There's a link between the environmental crisis and the inequality crisis generating poverty worldwide. Indiscriminate exploitation of renewable and non-renewable resources, in addition to producing environmental misery, is also responsible for social misery at the scale of the world, and this is getting worse. This cannot be ignored when we adopt drastic plans to correct the civilization activities of the humans of this world. Finally, Mr. President, we as a sovereign state advocate in favor of the protection of the Amazon forest. We have just been met with the presidents of Colombia and Suriname and the social movements of South America. We've got together to face our responsibilities as dwellers of South America and responsible for the survival of the rainforest forest and the survival of the Amazon forests. Thousands, the irreversible damage has been done there. If we do not act now, the original peoples, we need to turn to the original peoples. They need to tell us how to live in harmony with nature. The age-old original civilizations of the continent of the whole of the south, but also of the north of the American continent, have also considered the land and the forests as living organisms who think and feel like we do. Let us wake this truth up and let us leave behind arrogance, man-centered arrogance, which is preventing us to see what surrounds us as being sacred. We Venezuelans are not pessimistic, not known to be pessimistic. We are fighters. We are people who resist, and we love life. And we conceive humanity with a new spirituality. We see humanity as being reconciled in the future with nature and reconciled with itself and reconciled with the future. There is no longer, as Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher, said, there are no passengers on this planet. Everyone on this planet, or no one on this planet, is ready to accept a world without a future. We want to see this world continue to exist. Can the world count on us to bring back hope? Can the world count on us to pool together our resources, brothers and sisters, together and create a new humanity? The illusion of everlasting development is over. Let us now put an end to the damage caused to Mother Earth. Mr. President, brothers and sisters, time has run out. We can no longer indulge in speeches and rules. We need to adopt a radical change and bring about a new world, which is possible. Real life. Let the present be a second before eternity. Where there is a will, life will prevail. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Jose Maria Neves, President of Cabo Verde. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
President,
Chairman, heads of state and government, ladies and gentlemen, climate change and its consequences represent one of the gravest current threats to humanity. Our ability to combat and to mitigate these threats depends to a great extent on the solidarity between countries. It also depends on combining efforts deployed to find practical solutions and effective solutions at global level. Cabo Verde is one of the most vulnerable countries in Africa and in the world. It is a small island developing state with one of the lowest levels of greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the world. Cabo Verde contributes almost nothing, or indeed nothing at all, to climate change. But because of its vulnerable situation, it is a country that has suffered greatly from the consequences of climate change. Climate change has jeopardized the years of progress that we have made towards sustainable development. Unfortunately, the droughts that affect the archipelago are becoming more and more frequent, and they're lasting longer. We're also seeing worse and worse saltwater intrusion and the worsening of our groundwater. We're also seeing degradation of the soils and a loss of biodiversity. And these are only some of the issues. The COVID-19 pandemic and the energy crisis associated with climate change have considerably worsened the constraints and the structural vulnerabilities that the country suffers. We've seen worsening public debt and a worsening of social indicators, both of which represent significant challenges in achieving the goals set out in our national plans and also set by the Sustainable Development Goals in the United Nations 2030 Agenda. The country has played an active role in regional and international climate governance. It has signed key international conventions and agreements, in particular the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. At national level, Cabo Verde has made the fight against climate change and the mitigation of its effects an area of state policy. Measures to combat climate change are included in the country's main strategic development programs and plans. Strategic plans for sustainable development, plans for strategic development. This is a plan called Cabo Verde Ambition 2030. They are also included in the National Plan for Adaptation and in the nationally determined contribution. Cabo Verde has spared no effort to minimize the impact of climate change, and it's done this through planned and determined actions. These include the measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 35% by 2030. That requires greater use of renewable energies and low carbon transport. This can be achieved by introducing measures to encourage the use of electric vehicles, in particular in the public transport sector. In order to achieve effective climate governance, the country is counting on the support of its principal development partners and hopes to have easier access to the funds that have been set up to this effect. For small island developing states, such as Cabo Verde, it is essential that they can access global financing. To meet our nationally determined contribution, for example, Cabo Verde will have to mobilize around 2 billion euros over the next 10 years. In this context, I call on the international community to consider the possibility of transforming the debt held by small island developing states into climate investment, into education, into healthcare, and into the fight against poverty and inequalities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. George Mani Wee, President of Liberia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, heads of state and government, Her Excellency Madam Claire Marie Weah, First Lady of the Republic of Liberia, Your Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, the President of the 27th United Nations Climate Change Conference, heads of international organizations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to extend my profound thanks and appreciation to the government and people of the Arab Republic of Egypt for hosting the UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, in Egypt. When we attended COP26 1 year ago in Glasgow, Scotland,
Our world was just beginning to emerge from the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was a sense of recovery and a renewal of hope that we could once again act together in concert to refocus our collective efforts on mitigating the devastating effects of global climate change. We acknowledge our shortcomings in terms of inequity and admitted our shortfalls in meeting our target for reducing our carbon emissions and footprints. We also reconfirm our commitment to contribute higher levels of financing to support our efforts and review and re-evaluate our chances of limiting the rise in global warming to meet our temperature targets of 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2030. Now, 1 year later, as we meet in Sharm el-Sheikh today, we are observing, waiting, and hopeful that our promises made in Glasgow will be kept and pledges fulfilled. We are also saddened to note that inequity and imbalance still remain between high and low emitters in the climate change architecture, and that the financial flows within still remains disproportionate and unfair to low-emitting countries, especially those with significant carbon capture capability, who are expected to reserve their forests without commensurate benefits to their populations. So, as we assemble here once again to find a pragmatic and productive way forward, let us do so with renewed dedication, commitment, and sincerity, so that we harness our collective strength to develop lasting solutions that will save our world, not only for ourselves, but for generations yet unborn. Let us stand by the decisions and commitment we make at this COP27 conference here in Egypt to avert a global catastrophe. Ladies and gentlemen, together we can implement and make our one world a better place. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Sandrika Bersat Santokhi, President of Suriname. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, distinguished chair, members of the head table, leaders of the world, ladies and gentlemen. 1 year passed since COP26. Today, we are all more aware that concrete actions are needed now. Instead of more pledges, talks, and promises for the future. We are living the horrors of climate change, and yet we see no significant actions to live up to the Paris Agreement. Mr. Chair, I'm standing here as president of a small nation, but also as a representative of a very small group of countries, a group of only 3 countries in the world that are still carbon negative. My country, Suriname, is also part of a larger grouping of 11 high forest and low deforestation countries and part of the Amazon forest. Our nation is also part of the grouping of 51 small island developing and low-lying coastal states. Suriname's contribution to global emission is 0.01%, and we are net carbon sink. We are, in fact, carbon negative. Mr. Chair, despite this, we are highly vulnerable to climate impacts. My country has a low-lying vulnerable coast that is threatened due to the sea level rise, and has taken bold decisions to prepare itself. We have created a strong institutional and policy framework with a national climate change policy, strategy and action plan, a national adaptation plan, and sectoral policies that give high priority to climate objectives. With assistance from the IDB, we have transformed our NDC into investment plan with an estimated $700 million in climate change investments. Mr. Chair, Suriname is ready for a full implementation of its NDCs to deliver the results we promise and to protect ourselves from the ravages of sea level rise. Suriname has committed to protect our mangrove forests from our limited state budget. Next year, Mr. Chair, we'll sign our first national climate agreement that will show our strong commitment to maintain our forests, to prioritize clean energy, and to promote the integration of climate mitigation and adaptations actions. We are building our national technical capacity and expertise with support of international organizations to be effective in preparation, design, and implementation. Mr. Chair, our energy supply is already for 50% renewable, and we are adding more. Mr. Chair, in the wider Caribbean, many of us almost daily have to address climate change occurrences through external borrowing because we lack the resources. That's why we need support now to include loss and damage as a third pillar in the climate financing structure. Once these funds become available, we also need to simplify the procedures for access to climate finance and to make appreciable condition period more efficient and effective. We cannot wait years to receive climate finance. Let us make it simple, accessible, and make it work. Mr. Chair, let us not create another international bureaucracy. The Bretton Woods Institutes should incorporate climate change in their economic recovery programs in a more effective way. Climate change has become part of the economic paradigm. We call upon the international community to put its money where its mouth is. Mr. Chair, the international community has promised billions, but thus far too little has materialized. Ladies and gentlemen, promises made must be kept. Therefore, on behalf of our children and the next generation, we urgently call on the historic emitters to do more and to help to save our world. My country is doing its part in this regard with the limited resources and capacity. Mr. Chair, I thank you. May God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Antonio Costa, Prime Minister of Portugal.
Mr. President of COP27, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I begin by thanking the President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian government, and the Egyptian people for the warm welcome and well-organized forum that they have greeted us in this COP27. Science is clear. The climate emergency is a crisis that already affects us today. And the plight of the war in Ukraine cannot detract us from the urgency of answering the challenges of climate change. In fact, the consequences of this war have only shown us how necessary it is to accelerate the energy transition and decrease our reliance on fossil fuels. All of us are affected by the dramatic increase in energy prices arising from this war, leaving millions in a situation of energy poverty. Portugal, which has started to invest in renewable energies 15 years ago, is an example of how investing in transition ensures that we are less dependent and safer from an energy point of view. We cannot backtrack on our commitments. It's important that we leave Sharm el-Sheikh with a clear vision, allowing us to obtain results regarding the different questions that we are facing, from mitigation to financing, as well as adaptation and review of national determined contributions. This effort must be led by developed countries and major emitting countries. Excellencies, Portugal does not lose sight from its own compromises. Our goals are ambitious, but we have been able to meet them and even bring them forward. We believe that a just energy transition can be synonymous with growth and economic prosperity. But above all else, it's a moral imperative. As leaders, we owe it to our populations, to the rest of the world, and to future generations. With the entry into force last year of the first Climate Framework Law, we have reinforced our goal of achieving carbon neutrality until 2050, while committing to study the feasibility of its anticipation to 2045. Since Glasgow, we were able to bring forward by 2 years the closing of our last coal-fired power stations, which have already ceased to function last year. And despite the energetic crisis, we won't be reactivating them. We also continue to invest in renewable energies and have the capacity and ambition to go from fossil energy importers to green energy exporters. Today, renewable energies amount already to around 60% of our electricity consumption. And our goal is to reach 80% until 2026. We are also confident that green hydrogen and other renewable gases are energies for the future. We have reached a few days ago a deal with France and Spain to create a green energy corridor to supply the center of and northern of Europe. A very heartfelt word about wildland fires. It's a reality that is not always addressed in this forum, but it's of the utmost importance to reduce emissions and the capacity of the forest to play its role in carbon sequestration. The truth is that it is estimated that 6% of global CO2 emissions result from human-caused fires. In more extreme years, this number can even reach 20% of global CO2 emissions. Thus, significant improvements in the policies and processes of fire prevention and extinction are an important contribution to reducing emissions. It's in this framework that next year we will organize in Portugal the 8th International Wildland Fire Conference, during which we intend to create a new fire risk benchmark and its corresponding governance model. We invite all countries to participate and join us in this conference. Protecting our forests is a global challenge due to their role as carbon sinks and in the protection of soils and aquifers. It was with great enthusiasm that we heard the President-elect of Brazil, Lula da Silva, reaffirm his commitment to zero deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. Excellencies, we cannot obviously forget our responsibilities towards the global funding efforts. This conference, which takes place in the African continent, has to be capable of finding answers to the problems of this continent. Portugal has been strengthening our cooperation for climate action. Last September, we have signed with the African Development Bank a guarantee agreement of 400 million euro to support investments in 6 African countries: Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, São Tomé and Príncipe, in priority sectors which include renewable energies. But we intend to do more. In the framework of our strategy for Portuguese Cooperation 2030, which we are currently finalizing, we'll have a pillar dedicated to planet, and we are going to reinforce by 25% the support we give to our cooperation partners in this area to help fight climate change also in the African continent. Excellencies, sustainable ocean management is also central to our resilience to climate change. And it is also, oceans are the greatest regulator of climate. We must, in this domain, pursue science-based policies. It was in this spirit that we co-organized with Kenya the 2nd Oceans Conference in Lisbon. In this context, I would like to highlight the Sustainable Blue Economy Investment Forum, in which commitments in the amount of 10 billion euro in investment were made. Given the success of this initiative, we will hold next year, in 2023, a 2nd edition of this forum. Excellencies, Mr. President, allow me to finish. Multilateral dialogue is fundamental to achieving the Paris goals and finding answers to deal with global challenges. Together, we can walk towards carbon-neutral societies, societies which are resilient to the impacts of climate change, societies that manage their resources in an efficient, circular, and sustainable manner, societies which are driven by renewable energies and are guided by the principle of just transition. This is the society that Portugal wishes to build and help build. This is the path to peace, prosperity, and sustainable development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Irakli Garibashvili, Prime Minister of Georgia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear friends, I'm honored to address you on behalf of my country, Georgia. And I want to thank the President of the Arab Republic of Egypt for his leadership as our host and for the tireless efforts in the preparation of this very important event. Dear colleagues, climate change has become a challenge for our generation, and we as leaders of our countries are responsible to find a solution for the sake of humanity and our future generations. There is no time for deliberation. We need swift and result-oriented actions. In this spirit, Georgia is considering turning the Paris commitments into credible delivery and increasing the ambition of its nationally determined contributions in 2025. We have developed a very comprehensive Georgia's 2030 climate change strategy and subsequent action plan to further facilitate the ambitious agenda for climate change mitigation. Additionally, Georgia, with its long-term low-emission development strategy, targets to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 with unifying national efforts and with international support. Georgia has one of the cleanest grids. 85% of our electricity comes from renewable sources. And further enhancing the share of renewables energy is a strategic priority for my country. Additionally, we continue to support further non-traditional renewable energy development projects, such as solar, wind, hydrogen, geothermal, and other means of sustainable sources. I'm confident that a robust framework for increasing the resilience of our countries will be an important outcome of our negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh. However, these efforts can only be effective if the perspectives and contexts of developing countries in all regions are considered. Equitable geographical representation, sovereign equality, and dignity of all its member states is a fundamental principle of the UN's work and of this body. The principle to leave no one behind is echoed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Therefore, achieving equitable geographic representation in the composition of constituted bodies under the Convention remains among our highest priorities at this COP. In conclusion, dear friends, I encourage and remind all of our colleagues that success cannot be achieved alone. Only with joint efforts we will be able to reap the rewards. So let's work together and translate the outcomes of COP27 into prompt climate action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Surangel Samuel Whips, President of Palau. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for hosting the summit. Palau hopes that the coming together of this 27th Conference of the Parties, we commit to true change. We have a saying in Palau. It goes, "Ugulu lao ramatamalang," which refers to spending too much time talking about the impending disaster and only acting when it's too late. The time is now to act. From the extreme droughts in parts of the US, Europe, and China, and the floods in Pakistan and Australia, to the destructive storms in the Philippines and Florida, lives, crops, and homes have been destroyed. There is no doubt that we are facing the impacts of climate change. When we last met, I said, on Palau's experiences, you might as well bomb us. that might have been an easier fate. In Palau, we are being drawn and quartered. COVID decimated our economy. Even as we are working to rebuild, the climate crisis is tearing us apart, limb by limb. Extreme storms and floods continue to destroy our crops and homes and infrastructure. Just last Monday, we were hit by another storm, ripping off roofs and damaging infrastructure. Sea levels are rising, eating away at our coastlines and inundating our taro patches and farms and impacting food security. Droughts have caused water shortages. The extreme heat this summer killed over 30 million of our prized and beautiful jellyfish that are world-renowned because they're stingless. This is the third known event for Palau. It occurred in 1997, again in 2017, and now in 2022. They usually disappear each time for a period of 2 years. As one of our star attractions, we are at risk of losing a critical component of our tourism industry, further decimating our economy, which we are trying to rebuild after COVID. This reality underscores our urgent call today for all states to do what is needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We should no longer be held hostage to fossil fuels. Let's not let the war in Ukraine serve as an excuse for us to backslide on our commitments to transitioning to renewable energy. Today, we are calling for those who are the largest emitters of pollution to take responsibility for the damage they cause. Loss and damage to be fully operationalized, and easier and faster access to climate financing and adaptation and mitigation in the form of grants and not loans. We urge the developed nations to deliver on the $100 billion climate finance commitment and to at least double their collective provision for climate finance adaptation by 2025. There's a legend in Palau which offers some sense of hope. It's about two men who lived in adjoining caves in the village of Oigul in Airai. Mr. Baribra, who was good at making coconut syrup, and Mr. Amaredong, who was good at catching fish. Because they thought they were alone, they threw away their surpluses and created lots of waste. When they realized they weren't alone, they shared their excess and lived abundant lives. With everyone working together, we can address climate change. This must include the 23 million Taiwanese excluded from participating in UN conventions. Taiwan, like all of us, has contributed to the problem. However, they are committed to being part of the solution. They actively support other countries' climate aspirations while moving toward net zero emissions by 2050. We share one ocean, one atmosphere. We must share in the responsibility to find innovative solutions and commit to change our behaviors. I am not giving up. I know keeping below 1.5 seems unachievable. However, together, nothing is impossible. This week, here at COP, let us act to stop the torture, to save the world, and to provide hope for our children and theirs. Thank you, Rokman Masulang.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. Distinguished heads of the state and government, delegates, honored guests, we will continue with the delivery of national statement today in 30 minutes in this plenary. With this, I declare this joint meeting in the COP, CMP, and CMA adjourned.